There seems to be a consensus, both when you read research reports, when you hear folks talking at this conference, that renewable energy adoption in the emerging markets, however you want to define either one of those terms, is going to grow. But you seem to be more bullish than even a lot of the bulls. So what is it you see that they don't?
I look over a history of the last 25 years. If you look at the last 25 years, about when we started out, there were less than 10 countries that were really even using any kind of clean energy or renewable energy by any definition. Today, you've got about 150 countries who are involved one way or another, 195 countries that signed the COP21 agreement. The more important thing, I think the biggest change in the market and the reason I'm very bullish is number one, technology is in a very different place. We're going to be discussing that over today and tomorrow. The cost of most of these alternatives has come down so much. The costs when we started looking at renewables, again, about 20-some years ago, was so high that basically they were areas of interest to the aid organizations in Sweden to try a little experiment in Kenya, or the Norwegians to try a little experiment in Zambia. So it was a very, very limited experiment. Today, the cost of solar, of wind, of many other forms of renewable energy have come down dramatically. And I think what's happening is, like, for example, with the perovskites, the new technology that was written about, I think it was last month in Science. There were Cambridge and Oxford professors who've done recent research, and they expect the cost of solar to come down even more by another 20-25% very soon. So all of that, I think, bids well. The other reason that I might be more bullish, and I'll stop there, promise, is that if you look at China specifically, the Chinese right now have decided that renewables is kind of the next new thing for them. Post-2008, they threw so much into building the infrastructure. Yeah. They're doing exactly the same thing in a mini format with renewable energy. What they're doing is...
So we can look forward to ghost solar farms everywhere, as far as the eye can see?
Hopefully it won't be the ghosts, it will be the real, because they have so much energy need. So before they get to the ghost towns, I think they will have real needs to fulfill. And they're doing they are in an area where there's very few people to compete with, so they're controlling solar. Wind, they're starting to be huge in, and other renewables.
You talked about cost.
Yes.
I'm curious, we've seen until the last, say, 2 months or 3 months, you also, however, saw fossil fuel costs, or specifically oil prices, going down for a couple of years. Shouldn't that then have kind of retarded that growth in the emerging markets? If cost and price is one of the big things that's driving a growth in renewables in an emerging market, particularly where there's poverty, shouldn't that have been alleviating that a little bit?
If the prices of energy had translated into lower actual prices in emerging markets, they could have had that impact, absolutely, like they've had here. But I think what happened in emerging markets, for example, let's take India specifically. In India, the government subsidies got reduced, so the government is paying less towards subsidizing energy, but nothing really got passed on, or very little got passed on to the end consumer or the corporations or users of energy. So the impact was much less than in the developed world, for one thing. The second thing is, let's not forget, people are sick of oil and gas prices going up and down and being so volatile. They want energy security. They want a stable source of energy that is not so volatile.
I'm curious, how much, when you look, for example, in a place like China,
yes,
how much of the adoption, or the interest in adoption, I guess is probably the better way to say, of renewables is driven by, for example, is driven by price, as compared to kind of personal, the health issues. Here, in the United States, depending on where you are, unless you're in a place like Flint, generally it's politically driven, or at least kind of philosophically driven, or price driven. In a place like China, it might be actually health driven.
I think in China you'll have, the cost is important, but so much is centrally directed, and so much is centrally planned and centrally financed, that you need both. You need the government. Here we talk about policy and regulatory in one of the sessions. The policy regulatory framework is important because the government has to sort of push for this in a big way. The private sector has to be primed and excited about it. And of course, their stock market is a little bit more developed, so you see a lot more companies right now involved. On the social side, there has been a lot of unrest. I mean, people who, we all read here in the West about stories of people who've complained about their water being tainted, not having energy, the food being tainted, and so on and so forth. So there is a lot of social pressure. And I think that's another reason. If you decide to be the world's largest manufacturer of goods and the largest user of energy, you have to do something about your environment to be able to breathe that air. So the health, coming back to your point about health, I think in China, what has happened is the local situation, the fact that you can't breathe the air in Beijing, or similarly in India, you can't breathe the air in Delhi, is having a major, major impact now in reverse on the politicians to do something.
How much, I'm curious, one of the knocks, and I guess knocks on pushing renewables in certain emerging markets, or at least dilemmas, has been the lack of maintenance. In other words, so you can bring a system in, you can almost airlift a system in and drop it there, but if something breaks, who's going to fix it? Because that's not what the local repair folks have been trained to fix. Is that a delta that's shrinking, you think, or is that still a major problem?
I think it's a lot better. Again, 20 years ago, that was basically a showstopper, complete showstopper. You did not, once you bought the goods, they broke down within 6 months, and it was kind of the end of the story. Today, a lot of more R&D has been done, and I think the fact that a lot of, for example, solar and wind components are being made in emerging markets, not just in developed countries, has helped to create better technologies that are more appropriate for poorer, less engineer tech-based societies. Right. It's still not perfect. And if you see a lot of the venture capital money that gets spent in the US is on the very high-tech sort of early venture, not a lot has been spent on sort of the further development of these. That might be an area that might also happen in emerging markets, I think.
Do you think that finance, is that coming, or is that still being ignored, that second piece?
I think it's coming. And I think what is also interesting is some of the development banks, the multilaterals, are sort of people who put a lot of money early, and they've been putting a lot of money in this area. And you see them also starting to finance some of the work to improve the maintenance of the solar and of the hydro and of other sort of new equipment that you need to be able to use them. Also, by the way, maintenance also is needed because integration of all these various sources of renewable energy into your heating, into water, into transport, and into electricity is kind of complex.
Let me. I haven't asked you that was kind of an investment question, but that's what you are. You're an investor now. I'm curious. If you want to buy a public stock, it's pretty obvious how you do it, or to find a list of them, right? You just go and you find a list. These are the companies. These are tech companies or energy. If you want to be an impact investor, investing in emerging markets, and particularly in project finance-related emerging markets, where does that information come from? If that's what somebody wants to do, is there right now a good enough central repository or maybe dispersed depositories of information that you can use?
Highly dispersed, highly dispersed. So if you are an investor and you want to find the highest return projects that also have social impact and environmental impact, very hard to sort of find that. It's one of the things I'm doing in my day job. Also, some of the foundations I've been involved in, Ford Foundation, World Resources Institute, where we're trying to also, as well as at Rock Creek, to create lists of potential projects that are interesting to different groups. I think the list doesn't exist, sadly. And I think if you have some form of information with details, of the investments with potential return and what you can achieve, I think it will really help bridge the gap. There's a lot of money right now, apart from social impact, money by sovereign funds, pension funds, endowment foundations who are looking for return, and a lot of these projects are high return projects.
So you think there's more investment interest than there's more investment demand than you're able to at least identify the supply of projects?
Oh, absolutely, because not that there's not huge potential supply. It's just that they're not out there. So the two groups of people are really not well connected.
All right, you manage hedge funds, so let me ask you a hedge question, which is maybe broader macro, since you don't just invest in energy. How are you hedging against a possible Trump presidency? I'm serious. I mean, it's got to be something you're thinking about. Is the election? I'm curious. Can you just give me some general thoughts on how you view the investments you're making today vis-a-vis where things are going to be
I think
in a year?
One of the things that is really interesting about the whole potential of a Trump presidency is that you can't really hedge because you don't know exactly what Trump's position will be. You can only hedge if you know what you have to make an assumption on what somebody's position will be. So let's take debt.
Yep.
He has the largest potential debt issuance program, given all the things he's talked about, of everybody.
Yeah.
At the same time, he said that he might not pay back. So there's a little dichotomy.
So that means people should redeem all their money and pull it out.
So
and
if
put
you
it in
were
an
the
asset.
Chinese sovereign fund or somebody else, holding a lot of debt, that would lead you to think about that seriously. So I think he really is forming his own ideas. So it's much too early to hedge.
Let me ask, I guess, one last investment question, which is you mentioned venture capital earlier and how they're really investing on the early stage of things. And one of the places, as you said, that a lot of money is getting invested is the future of kind of smart homes, smart cities, and technologies around it. When you think about that vis-a-vis emerging markets, is that even something is that a conversation worth having today? Or is it or not yet? Because if it hasn't really pulled off yet in the developed world, it's going to take so much longer to get to the emerging markets.
It's going to happen in emerging markets even earlier because there are going to be more cities made in emerging markets. And the other thing that has happened with communication is that all these mayors hang out together. And whether they're mayors of American cities or mayors of European cities or mayors of Kenyan cities, and they really talk about their different ideas.
Where do they hang out? Like, is there a
They
club?
have meetings, and they
Yeah.
Fortune may have the next meeting of mayors.
Brainstorm mayor?
Yeah.
I like that. That's
And they are really sharing seriously a lot more than they did before. And since they're starting from scratch, it's much easier if you're starting from scratch or very little developed city to impose new rules and adopt renewable energy versus if you're in an existing city with a lot of existing infrastructure and existing interests who may not want you to move towards renewable.
Are the solutions, though, that are going to be coming for them, are the solutions the same, or do they become almost tiered solutions?
The solutions really depend on the size. I mean, in Brazil, you'll have cities with tens and tens of millions of people.
Yep.
And then you'll have, whether it's in Asia or in Africa, very small cities. I think what's the nice thing about renewable, and again, going back to the first question you asked me why I'm so bullish about renewables, what renewables allow you to do is to be able to invest in both the larger projects. You can think about the large hydro projects, but you can also go off and do the microgrid and the pico projects. And those can be for very, very small cities and give access to the less, to the poorer, but also poorer cities and the new cities.
Well, it's going to be fascinating to watch. Thank you so much for taking the time. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you.